the uh, notes here on the protests and movements of this. Now, the first thing we need to talk about is the man who inspired Dr. King, and that was Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma was a title given to him, which means great soul. He says strength does not come from physical capacity, it comes from indomitable will. And so, what I need you to get here about Mahatma Gandhi, he is the prophet, if you want to call him that, of nonviolence. His motives, his 6 principles of nonviolence will later inspired Dr. King to go and do what he did. On the subject there, Dr. King said Christ, he is a Christian preacher by the way, Christ furnished the spirit and the motivation while Gandhi furnished the method. And so that was in 1958, right after he became a very important man and a thing that we will talk about later on. Okay? So that is our nonviolent movement. We'll get more into that when we talk about the African Americans, and I have 4 whole days on that. All right? Now, Ralph Nader, who later runs for president in 2000, wrote a book in the 60s called Unsafe at Any Speed. And it says it's the design and dangers of the American automobile. Automobiles in the 60s and kind of up into the early 70s and 50s and 40s, earlier than that, did not require seat belts. And so the accidents were pretty gruesome. I mean, if you had an accident back then, you probably weren't walking away. So Ralph Nader is a big person in getting consumer protection laws, etc. And the biggest thing is they will start requiring a seatbelt. Now, it's not the seatbelts we have today. It was mainly just a lap belt. But it was a start, and from there, consumer protection has now become a major, major role. So I guess we could put him as a muckraker, to be honest with you. Now, another person that would be a muckraker is Rachel Carson. Her thing of choice is environmentalism. And she wrote a book called Silent Spring, and I ask people in the class all the time, what does spring sound like? Well, there's bees and there's birds. Well, she goes, well, imagine if there's spring and you hear nothing because everything's dead because we've killed it. And that's a scary concept to think about. Now, her main thing she was boycotting in this book is a pesticide called DDT. And she said that if we keep using DDTs to take care of the crops are going to dissipate, they're going to disappear, and we're going to have nothing. So we got to stop doing this. So what then is a pesticide? Well, remember the suffix there, "-cide", means to kill something. So this is something used to kill the pest, and that could be a weed, whatever. Now, more often than not, what happens with a pesticide is it has a harmful after effect. Now, DDT, it destroys the ozone. But by far the most notorious pesticide we had, if we talked about this before, was Agent Orange used in Vietnam. We use this to exactly what it's called, not only kill the stuff on the trees, but kill the trees themselves. So we could see the Co Chi tunnels and where these Viet Cong were hiding. The problem is it led to horrible birth defects in the children. And so move from there. Now, we're going to talk about getting up into the hippie movement. The students become involved here. The baby boomers, as we called them, had a completely different mindset, and that was to rebel. And it all started with a group called Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. Their slogan says, there's a change going to come. They had a secondary slogan that said, don't trust anyone over 30. And so this is mainly a college movement. They do occupy college things. And in fact, Jane Fonda, Hanoi Jane, her boyfriend was the leader of this group. And so this is an important group because they start moving. Now, Students for a Democratic Society, there's our leader there talking, were based in part on an earlier movement called the Free Speech Movement by Mario Savio. Mario Savio is right here, and he wanted freedom of speech because if you remember during war, and especially during the anti-communist Red Scare, what you could say was greatly curtailed or held back. And so they actually had a movement at the University of California, Berkeley, and they won free speech. And so this is an important thing moving forward because free speech has been protected for many, many years. And so it's going a different direction than it was before this. Now, both of these kind of collide. The free speech movement, you're allowed to say this, don't trust women over 30, and the entire youth generation group called themselves a counterculture. Now, that means our culture in the 1960s was concerned about Vietnam, and they were concerned about just keeping things the way they were going. The counterculture will be concerned against protesting against anything that regular culture considered sane or wise. And this is where the guys begin to grow their hair long and they wore the beaded clothings. There became a big focus on astronomy. Music radically changes with Jimi Hendrix and Bob Dylan, the Beatles, and I mean, this is a major movement. So what makes the counterculture so unique? Why were they so going against? Number one, their first unique aspect is their fashion, their hair, their clothing, etc. And even today, we see aspects of their hair and their clothing. Number two is their art. What they considered to be art as well as music was radically different, and so from there, a lot of different genres of rock and roll and blues and different things have been born, and people have made a living. And the last thing is the thing that made them probably the most, hate to say unique, but the thing that made them, where people kind of look down on them, I guess, is that in a really weird evangelical kind of religious way, they praised the use of mind-altering drugs. It started out with marijuana and peyote, but later on it moves to LSD, and I'm going to save that because I've got somebody here in a second about that. Now, our first big protest song we have is called Alice's Restaurant by Arlo Guthrie, right here, and it's an epically long song, and he basically just goes through and talks about if society was as the people said. And so first time we have somebody openly criticizing people and getting away with it in a song. And we hear this many today. There's rappers out there talking about, they want to blow up the White House and different things like that. And the question is, how are you allowed to do that? There you go. Now we move to the guy who really helped the counterculture with their drug thing move on. This is Dr. Timothy Leary. Dr. Timothy Leary was a Harvard professor hired by the government to experiment with convicts to try and change their mind and re-alter their brain, reprogram them so they wouldn't want to go to jail. In the process of this, he created a drug that is called LSD, or acid, as some people might call it. Now, the program was shut down because it really wasn't producing much effect, and so Timothy Leary took this and began to preach to the counterculture. And he won a major victory in support in the fact that the Beatles listened to him, and this is where the Beatles start to turn a little weird and move stuff on this. And they began to listen to him. And then people wanted to listen to Timothy Leary. What was he about? And he gave us a quote that summed up the counterculture very, very simply. And it was simply, turn on, tune in, drop out. 6 little words that the counterculture took to and understood what he was meaning. Turn on to this movement, this different thing. Tune out, regular society. And as well, drop out of regular society. And you would move to a commune or California, etc. Now, one man took this radically different, and he had a commune, he had LSD, he was a big fan of the Beatles, in fact, and he had a bunch of followers who would listen to him. That man's name is Charlie Manson, and famously he had the Manson murders in the 1960s, which were inspired by a Beatles song and an LSD trip, and as well as Charlie Manson being, just all kinds of crazy. So there it is. Now, Timothy Leary is no longer with us, and his ashes were actually scattered in space. So there you go. Now, the culmination, the apex, the top of the mountain of counterculture was Woodstock. 3 days of peace and music in 1969 called the Summer of Love. Now, if you remember, 1968 is the year that the United States almost came apart. So 1969 is important in revamping us and getting us back together. So they go and they have this music fest, and there's all kinds of different things going on here. Now, in the end of this, once they go back, they will never be the same. The counterculture kind of forms after that into the 70s and start getting real jobs, and the counterculture movement kind of dies out. By the 70s, we have a new horrible thing called disco. So there you go. Now, in 1999, on the 30th anniversary of this, they tried to have another Woodstock. Now, the main problem here is the bands being chose here were not... I mean, you go back to 1969, you have Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, Jimi Hendrix, and they're talking about love and peace and all that stuff. They invited Metallica and Ice Cube and Limp Bizkit and Korn and aggressive music, because that's what the 90s was about, was aggressive music. And it did what it was intended to do, and it got people aggressive. They were upset with the fact that they were being charged $5 or something, $6, incredible for a bottle of water. And as a band from the 90s was instructed to do, they raged against the machine and caused a massive riot. So we learned that Woodstock was a product of the environment, that the atmosphere of the 60s was the only way it would happen. And unfortunately, if you enjoy that, it will never happen again. All right, so that is the end of the 1960s and protest movements. The next thing we're going to pick up with is the 70s and Nixon, and that's all kinds of fun.